Good morning, and welcome to this public meeting of the United States Consumer Product Safety Commission. Let me begin by saying that since our last public meeting, much has happened. One of the changes has been the arrival of Commissioner Dana Biacco, and this morning I am so very pleased to welcome Commissioner Dana Biacco to her first public meeting at the Consumer Product Safety Commission. Thank you. Commissioner Biacco joined the Commission on June 1st of 2018, and prior to that was a partner at the Jones Day Law Firm, first in Boston, and prior to that she joined the firm in Pittsburgh in 1998. Before her time at Jones Day, she served as a federal law clerk to the Honorable Gustav Diamond, U.S. District Court Judge for the Western District of Pennsylvania. She also served as chair of the Pennsylvania Bar Association House of Delegates. Commissioner Biacco earned her law degree from Duquesne University and earned a BA in journalism from Ohio University. She is married and has a teenage daughter, Ava. I want to just extend my welcome, and I know I speak on behalf of my colleagues, how pleased and honored we are to have you join the Commission, and we look forward to working together with you.
Thank you.
Secondly, yesterday the Senate confirmed our fifth Commissioner, Peter Feldman. The confirmation yesterday included the time period for Commissioner Feldman to complete the term of Joe Mohorovic. They also invoked cloture for a second term for Commissioner Feldman, and that will be voted on sometime this week. So I do expect Commissioner Feldman will be joining us shortly, and I am pleased that finally the Commission will have its full complement of commissioners. And I want to say this publicly, and I know my colleagues, I know they join me in this sentiment, that we look forward to working together to promote the cause of safety and keep consumers safe from unreasonable risks of injury and harm. One other big change here at the agency is the arrival of Patrice Rock Grant as our new video production specialist. And I don't know if Rock, given his responsibilities right now, if he can come out and just poke his head out here. But for those who haven't met him yet, Rock took over for John McGugan when John McGugan retired in July, among a host of other duties. And Rock fortunately had a lot of time with John and got to see the entire range of work that John did and now Rock is doing. But he fulfills the critical role of AV support for public hearings such as this one this morning. Prior to joining CPSC, Rock was in California producing news segments, PSAs, and all kinds of wonderful videos for the American Forces Network. It is truly an honor, and I'm so pleased to welcome Rock here this morning as our new AV specialist. So as you can see, lots of change, and there will be continue to be changed. But all while the change is happening, we will keep our eyes focused on the ball, and I know all of our staff will at the agency as well as my colleagues, and we look forward to really working together to move the ball forward on safety. Now to the business at hand. We have one item on our agenda this morning, and it is our ops plan for fiscal year 2019. CPSC's annual operating plan provides information on program activities and strategies as set forth in the agency budget process, along with specific performance targets and key milestones for the agency. Essentially, the ops plan is a roadmap for the Consumer Product Safety Commission. The CPSC staff this morning that join us at the table are Mr. Jay Hoffman, who is CPSC's Chief Financial Officer and Director of the Office of Financial Management, and Mr. James Baker, Budget Office and Division Director for Budget, Planning, and Evaluation. I want to say that program staff are also here and available to answer any questions, and that will come in a second panel. I want to say to Jay and James, thank you for all your work to develop the ops plan. This is a particularly busy time of the year. Yesterday you had a meeting with OMB, and now you've got end of year that you're looking at. So thank you both for being here and for all the work that went into this. So the staff will brief us this morning, and at the conclusion of their briefing, I will turn to the commissioners and for rounds of questions for the two staff persons from the financial office. And then we will bring up the second panel of the program staff so that if there are any questions for them, they can be asked as well. So with that, we will now begin with the briefing, and you may go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning, Madam Chairman, Commissioners. I will provide you with an overview of the FY 2019 operating plan, and as Acting Chairman Burkle mentioned, it's been a busy time, but we've had a lot of collaboration with the program staff for this, and it's been a very collaborative process, and I think we've got a very good product because of that. Next slide. The FY 2019 operating plan process. The staff started developing the operating plan late in the spring. They considered a broad range of inputs. This is included, but is not limited to, the FY 2019 performance budget request to Congress, the priorities hearing, and the Commission direction of the FY 2018 mid-year review. Congress has not yet enacted an FY 2019 appropriation, but has passed appropriation bills in both chambers. The House mark is $127 million, and the Senate mark is $126 million. Conference report is still pending. We usually base the operating plan on the President's budget request to Congress, and then adjust during the mid-year process to reflect the final enacted appropriation. This has served to be a good approach when continuing resolutions are common, and especially when a final enacted appropriation level is uncertain. However, this year, since the appropriations process is further along than it usually is, we have premised the FY 2019 operating plan level at the $126 million level, the lower of the two past appropriation levels, and equal to the FY 2018 enacted level. As is our standard practice, we will use the FY 2019 mid-year review process that will occur in the spring of 2019 to amend this operating plan as needed to make it consistent with the final enacted full-year appropriation. Strategic Plan Alignment. The CPSC's operating plan is the key implementation plan for the Commission-approved strategic plan. As part of the operating plan development, the programs have identified or develop priority activities that will move them to achieving their strategic goals and objectives. The priority activities are presented in the detail by organization section of the operating plan document and can also be found in Appendix B, where they are aligned to their appropriate strategic goal and objective from the strategic plan. Strategic goals and budget priorities. As I mentioned on the prior slide, the operating plan is a key implementation plan for the strategic plan and its 4 strategic goals, which are Strategic Goal 1, Workforce. Cultivate the most effective consumer product safety workforce. Strategic Goal 2, Prevention. Prevent hazardous products from reaching consumers. Strategic Goal 3, Response. Respond quickly to address hazardous consumer products both in the marketplace and with consumers. And Strategic Goal 4, Communication. Communicate useful information quickly and effectively to better inform decisions. Also, as staff formulated the FY 2019 operating plan, they focused on the budget priorities of the Commission as found on page 2 of the FY 2019 performance budget request to Congress. These budget's priorities are: focus on risk. Focus resources on the highest priority consumer product safety risks. Import surveillance. Continue to support import surveillance by incrementally developing the RAM system to identify and stop non-compliant imported products. Outreach and education. Emphasize collaboration, outreach, and education by engaging all stakeholders through forums and workshops. And finally, data-driven. Expand the sources and types of data analysis used to identify hazards and inform compliance decisions. The op plan organization of the document. The left column outlines the op plan's contents. The first page of the FY 2019 operating plan contains the summary of changes from FY 2018 enacted level to the FY 2019 proposed operating plan level. On page 2 is the funding and FTE by organization for FY 2019. This is followed by the key performance measure summary that lists by strategic goal every FY 2019 key measure and its target. The lead office for each key measure is also identified. Starting on page 6 is the table for the proposed voluntary activities for FY 2019. This table also shows what voluntary standards activities were included in the FY 2019 budget request to Congress. Page 9 has the proposed mandatory standards work for FY 2019. Like the voluntary standards table, this table provides mandatory standards activities that were included in the FY 2019 budget request. The operating plan details by organization section starts on page 10. This section provides details on the EXHR, compliance, import surveillance, international, communications, and IT organizations. Now, please draw your attention to the right column of this slide. The details for each of the organizations just named include a resource summary of funding and FTE, an overview of the office and its FY 2019 priority activities, a description for each of its projects and how they align to the strategic plan. It also lists the key performance measures and operating plan measures and targets for that office, as well as the milestones. There are also two appendices to this document. The first provides the key changes to the performance measures for the FY 2019 from the FY 2019 performance budget request. The second appendix then provides the operating plan details for each of the 4 strategic goals and, as mentioned before, align the priority activities to the goals. There are a few notable issues and assumptions with the operating plan. The proposed operating plan funding level is the same as the FY 2018 enacted level, but I do want to point out a few things. First, there is no FY 2019 funding assumed for the VGB grant program. The agency has a $1.5 million balance of no-year funds available for new awards. This balance reflects the 5 grants just awarded on Monday for approximately $1 million. Second, this funds an FTE level of 538 and assumes a pay raise of 1.9% as included in the Senate's appropriations bill. Lastly, this resolves some non-pay inflation shortfalls as much as possible. Operating plan by budget category. Finally, I want to draw your attention to a breakout of the $126 million operating plan level by 4 budget categories. Of particular note is that 65% of the operating plan is dedicated to payroll costs, and that, along with $9.6 million for rent and security, comprise nearly 3/4 of our dollar resources. Those 2 budget categories are hard to change and limit our funding flexibility and options for project support and IT initiatives and services. This completes the overview of the FY 2019 operating plan, and I thank you for your attention, and Jay and I are happy to address any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Baker. With that, now I'll turn to the Commission for any questions, and we will each have 5 minutes to conduct our round of questioning. I'm going to just begin by asking, you mentioned in your comments on page 2, and then you mentioned it later on, in what a large proportion of our budget, both wages and the rent, utility, and security. So the rent, utility, and security is $9.565 million. Can you just elaborate on that a little bit? What does that include for the agency?
So I have the detailed table here. I can talk a little bit about that. So the rent, security, and utilities, the $9.5 million is comprised of the following: roughly $5 million in rent and security and utility costs here at the headquarters building, about $3.9 million at the 5RP laboratory facility, and about $500,000 at the warehouse.
And do we, does this allow for inflation? How do you accommodate inflation, cost of increase, perhaps for a contract or for rent or for utilities?
Yeah.
How is that factored in?
So, first I will say that we're fully allocated for FY19. It's a very astute question, and we are worried about a shortfall in that line item. Typically what we do in terms of addressing inflationary costs, which I think is at the heart of your question, we have $3 million in payroll inflationary costs in this operating plan. there are basically three levers that we pull. The first is FTE reductions when we can't make everything fit, and you're seeing that in this operating plan. We've reduced 7 funded positions from FY18 to FY19. Every 7 positions roughly equates to $1 million. We have done a number of internal reallocations where possible, where we see differences between execution and budget levels on non-pay items to cover overages or underages. And lastly, we take on a number of efficiency initiatives where we can, but these are longer term, things like the Shared Services Initiative, which we've been briefing the Commission on, that will result in savings over the long term to try to offset some of these inflationary needs. Now keep in mind that that assumes a flat funding profile. When the funding profile begins to decline, those inflationary pressures are essentially a reduction added onto any other cuts that are being mandated by Congress. And that's when you get into real program cuts, non-pay program cuts.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Adler.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman, and I want to join in welcoming our colleague, Commissioner Dana Biacco. It turns out we both share a Pittsburgh connection. Unfortunately, the Steelers didn't have a good start this year, but they did win their most recent game. But it's a delight to sit down and reminisce about what a wonderful city Pittsburgh is. Also want to thank the staff for an excellent briefing package and for an excellent briefing. And I have a number of questions. I want to start with just a quick comment, though. I look at the op plan and I see no decrease in voluntary standards work. I don't have a problem with that. I do see less output in mandatory standards, and I have a couple comments about mandatory standards. But I also want to point out that today we have only one person who is currently involved as a voluntary standards coordinator who has a vast array of responsibilities and also who's brought a commitment to expanding the work of this office. I see that we now, and I'm thrilled about this, now have 3 FTEs in the Small Business Ombudsman Office, and I see we have a big staff in International, both of which are fine with me. But if our new order is voluntary standards, and I occasionally dissent to that, I believe it is time we provided additional resources to Patty Edwards to do her excellent work. So I just want to give everybody a heads up. I'm going to be circulating an amendment to the op plan to provide added resources for this critical job. So turning to mandatory standards, and this is sort of on page 9, I see that the staff listed no resources for window coverings in mandatory standards. It's clear we're going to be spending a lot of money and dedicating a lot of resources to this project. And what concerns me is if we simply delist it, that sends, I think, a wrong message to the world, which is under no circumstances will we move to do mandatory standards work, and that is not a proposition with which I agree. So I guess I will just ask my colleagues to consider listing this as a DATR, data analysis, since we can't do a mandatory standard unless we do voluntary standard, and we are doing voluntary standards work. But here's a question that I do have, and this is with respect to a project's very important to me, and that's table saws. It's no longer listed as a final rule. It's now listed as a briefing package. And can somebody please explain this change? And I know we were doing a 2017 special study on injuries from different saw types, and could somebody at least give a quick summary of the results of that special study? I have no questions for these two. I'm sorry. Yeah, no, that's fine. Thank you for. Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot the organization of the meeting. So I have no further questions for you guys.
But remember that question, because he's coming back to it.
Because it's coming.
That's for you, Dwayne. Commissioner Kay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I also want to welcome our new colleague and Steelers fan to the Commission. I think it's going to be great. We're very excited to have you. And Commissioner Feldman, if you're watching online, we look forward to seeing you here at the next meeting. And congratulations to you as well. I also want to add a congratulations to our new Acting Executive Director, Mary Boyle. We're excited for you to be in that position and hoping we strike that first word very soon in your title. I have no questions for this panel. Thank you for the great job.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Biacco.
Thank you, and I appreciate the warm welcome. I want to point out to all of you Ravens fans out there are 3 Steeler fans up here. This could be very fun. Thank you all for the good work that you've done. I've only been here, as you know, a short time, and the first thing that I've noticed is just how efficient and effective our team is here. So I appreciate the amount of work that went into preparing for today. One question that I have on the budget category is that in this day of technology, our IT department and the related infrastructures are more important than ever. How were the projects and investments in IT prioritized?
Well, I think our CIO is going to be on the second panel, and so I think I would defer to him on the specific projects. I think at a macro level, I can tell you that we've held the IT budget flat for a number of years, and that's starting to manifest itself in a lot of what I'll call legacy application obsolescence, which Jim can speak to more intelligently. So I think it's a timely question.
Thank you. You also mentioned, Jay, the shared services initiatives. Can you expand a little bit on how those initiatives will lead to a more efficient use of funds in that area?
I'm excited to talk about that. So we are in the process, for those watching and here in the public, of moving from the Department of Transportation, who currently offers us financial management services, to the Department of Treasury's financial shared service provider. And we're actually going to expand our services, going from what's just kind of accounting, debits and credits, and some reporting, and expanding that into the procurement area. What's exciting about this is we have, for the last 5 or 6 years, really struggled with cost containment. In our current agreement, costs have gone up 115% in that time, and in fact, they're going up 42% just this year. Moving to this new shared service provider will hopefully get us off of that highly volatile agreement with Department of Transportation. I mean, no offense to Department of Transportation, but I think that's really the key. So while we're excited to move to a new provider, I think I'm most excited about trying to unshackle ourselves from some of this volatility. In terms of the savings that we expect, we're looking at over $2 million savings over a 5-year period. That savings will really come in 3 categories. So category number 1 is marginally reduced costs to our financial management and financial reporting, our accounting operations. That includes reduced personnel costs here at CPSC of at least probably 2 people in the long run. We'll need fewer individuals sort of tracking down invoices and working across interagency agreements. The second piece is we'll have less cost on the procurement system side here at CPSC. Will no longer be required to operate our own procurement contract writing system. And then third, there are just some marginal efficiencies with our credit card programs. So we're excited about this change. It's going to be a lot of work this year. We appreciate the support of the Commission as we undertake this.
Thank you very much. That's all I have.
Thank you very much, and let me just express my appreciation for your willingness to look for those efficiencies. I think it's critical to our mission, and in order to balance some of the other things that we have no control over. So thank you. I'll ask my colleagues, any other further questions for the finance team? So we have no further questions for you. I understand you'll be in the room in case something comes up along the way of our hearing this morning. But at this time, I'd like to call to the table the program folks. Joining the table now is Mr. Dwayne Ray, Deputy Executive Director of Safety Operations, Dr. George Borlace, Assistant Executive Director for Hazard Identification and Reduction, Mr. Rob Kay, Director of Compliance, and Ms. Erin Joyce, Director of Office of Communications. I want to point out and I mentioned this earlier in my comments, there are other staff in the room in case you have questions that are even more specific to a directorate. That staff will be available for any questions that you might have. Again, we will begin with rounds of 5 minutes per commissioner, and I will begin the round of questioning for this newest panel of program directors. Everyone all set? Good, good. Let me welcome all of you here this morning, and again, thank you, along with the Finance Office, for all of the work that went into this operating plan. I do appreciate that work. I want to talk a little bit about the priorities in the ops plan. If anyone has heard me speak, not just since I've been the acting chair, but prior to that as a commissioner, my priorities have remained the same. I think that the agency needs to focus on the highest level of risks, and how we do that, and really key to our mission, I believe, is data, and then having the ability to analyze that data. Commissioner Biacco got to that a little bit with the technology, and we'll be talking more about that today. Beyond that is import surveillance, and I see that Jim is in the next row of program staff. So let me just talk a little bit about one of my priorities, which I didn't mention, is collaboration, education, that kind of engagement where we can leverage the expertise of the outside world with whatever it is we are working on. And I'm pleased because staff is having more tech-to-tech meetings. We're having more discussions about how to solve some of these safety issues. And staff is very creative in finding other ways to engage and educate and be involved. I want to just ask, and I'll ask Mr. Ray and then Dr. Borlace and even Mr. Kay, do you see these investments as paying off in real safety advances?
Thank you, Chairman, for that question. I think from my perspective, I definitely see the benefits of our activities in trying to advance a number of these initiatives. I think with regards to specific projects, frankly, we don't always have all the expertise in-house to solve the problem. So it does require us to work with others and outside organizations to advance our knowledge and solutions to the risk. I think when I think about our discussion on data and finding sources, one of the challenges, and I say it a lot around here, is more data that we can't process isn't helpful for us. So I think you'll see in the operating plan some activities that are trying to focus on being able to handle and process the data that we have now, but also to look to see if there are other sources of data that would be more beneficial to help us act and on the most risky issues that we're trying to deal with. I don't want to steal Jim's thunder on import surveillance. I think the Commission has given great support for that area and continues to support that. I think we're in the operating plan this year. There is a scheduled cut, as Jay mentioned, 7 FTEs, and some of those are in our import surveillance team and compliance team. And I think we've had some questions about the impacts and some of the goals, so those are going to play out. But I think there's still that focus on updating incrementally our RAM system, the improvements to that, and looking at new sources of data within that to move forward.
Thank you very much. Dr. Borlace, do you have anything to add to that in terms of real safety implications?
I would just say that when we look at, from the Commission-approved strategic plan, especially for what EXHR has with prevention and preventing these from even reaching the marketplace, we have in the strategic plan the CPSC risk management process, which starts with the data. We've aligned the 19 priority activities in focusing on some specific data things to try and improve the quality of the data coming in. To Dwayne Ray's point, more data is not necessarily better data. So trying to do that, and especially under the leadership of Mr. Steve Hanway, the new Director of Epidemiology, we're already starting to make some inroads there. And then with respect to the specific other priority activities, we are focused on trying to solve these hazard problems, and there's different approaches to it, and we're putting all our efforts in trying to address the problem, whether it's through the voluntary standards approach, mandatory standards approach, whatever we need to try and do to advance, the safety and address the hazard is what we're focusing on in 19.
Thank you. Before I ask Mr. Kay that question, I just want to indicate to my colleagues the dais timers are not working, So Alberta, okay, but in the meantime, I think you'll be holding up papers. Your timer is working though, right? Okay, so you'll keep us honest. Okay, good. Mr. Kay?
Just to sort of build off that theme, we want to be asking, first of all, the right questions in a compliance context, and then once we know what those questions are, we want the best available information to answer those questions, and whether that be through further collaboration or some of the other data sources that we rely on a regular basis. The higher quality information we have, the better decisions we'll make, and the more efficiently we'll make those decisions.
I'm not sure how much time I have left. I want to ask a data question, but I think that... Okay. Commissioner Adler.
Thank you. I want to return to the question that I was asking before, and I apologize for my confusion about who was sitting in front of us, and I thank the chairman for so sweetly correcting me. No, it was very, very nicely done. And that is to go back to the issue of table saws, and I noticed that in the op plan it's been shifted from a final rule to a briefing package. Can somebody please explain this change, and in particular, does this have to do with results from the 2017 special study on differential types of injuries, injuries from different types of table saws?
So, Commissioner, thanks for the question on table saws. We shifted it, as you pointed out, from what was in the budget request to a briefing package in 19 based on where we are now. We did complete the 2017 special study. We are still analyzing the results, putting that report together, which we expect to have to the Commission in the first quarter of this upcoming fiscal year. Consistent with the Commission direction, we'll have the report plus the notice of availability to publish that and have the comment period open for the public to comment on the results of the study. So the shift really reflected where we are now with the table saw study and the fact that we haven't completed it, had it up to the Commission, let alone public comment. So after the comment period closes, we expect in 19 to analyze the comments that we get on that, plus all of the other NPR comments, and we see that as kind of the work through 19.
Thanks very much. Ms. Joyce, I see you don't have a name tag, but I think I remember you. So I just wanted to ask one question. Looking on page 4 of the op plan, I see there's a drop in the number of impressions of safety messages. It looks reasonably significant, from about 4,500 to 4,000 in FY 2019. Is there an explanation for this drop?
I think this is a reflection of the change in how consumers get their news. Mm-hmm. So we're dropping a little bit on the number of impressions overall that we are counting because engagement and how consumers engage with social media, or whether or not if it went over a TV screen, did they see it, did they react? So, so we're trimming our goals for fiscal year 19 to see if we can bring up more engagement stats to sort of balance that out.
Okay, and since I have you there, I wanted, and you're sitting next to Mr. Kay, this is a question for the two of you. So, Rob, on page 24, I see you've got a project which is number 34789, Recall Effectiveness, which is the development of a plan aimed at improving recall effectiveness, which of course I applaud. And Aaron, on page 33, under project code 44563, recalls and alerts, you have a project to announce and raise consumer awareness about product safety recalls. So if ever there were a Reese's Pieces moment, this would be it. So I guess what I'd like to ask the two of you, if you could explain how these projects fit together and what your plans are, in the chairman's words, for collaboration between the two offices. This is something that I've been calling for and urging, and so I'd be delighted to hear any progress that you have made in coordinating your efforts in terms of recall effectiveness and recalls.
I think that it really states the obvious that there's an important communications component to any project that relates to recall effectiveness. And so I think it is I think it's a great question, and it is important that we coordinate our efforts. As the Commission knows, we recently issued an RFI as it relates to recall effectiveness follow-up from the workshop we did last year. We're currently in the process of evaluating the responses that we got to that RFI and planning next steps, and I know that we'll be working closely with Erin and her office in terms of what our options are with respect to those next steps, and then more generally in terms of how we work to make the recalls that come out of compliance effective. There's ongoing dialogue on a regular basis with respect to all of our announcements and communication strategies that I think we'll seek to continue to coordinate on as we move forward.
Ms. Joyce, I think I'm running out of time, but if you could at least help me understand how you plan to operationalize this, that would be very helpful.
Well, we've already started. Carol Cave has been helping to drive some meetings and looking at the process and how we can get a little farther upstream in terms of how communications helps to advise how messages are designed or how they're structured and strategized during the negotiation process with the regulated community. And I think the public input from the RFI that Rob referenced is also giving us a lot of ideas in working more closely with the not only stakeholders on behalf of consumers, but the regulated industry that we work with as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Kaye?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, everybody. Dr. Borlace, I'd like to start with a product that is important for keeping kids safe at home, and that's gates. And there are obviously gates that are used at various points in the house, like to try to keep kids out of a kitchen when you're cooking, and also gates at the top of the stairs or at the bottom of the stairs. In 2016, I know you're familiar with these stats, there were an estimated 2,900 emergency department treated injuries associated with baby gates involving children younger than 5 years old. This is an increase from the previous year, and 5 deaths occurred between 2011 and 2014, the most recent years that stats are available. Our last voluntary standards activities report notes that the staff has raised the issue of push-out forces, meaning what it would take for a child to move that gate, in the ASTM voluntary standards meetings at various points over the last 3 years. ASTM, my understanding, issued a ballot that included the push-out testing procedure and requirements on February 14th of this year. Staff's ballot response outlined staff's recommendations, and that was submitted to ASTM on June 10th of this year. And staff's ballot response included a spreadsheet with 13 critical incidents that illustrated the serious hazards associated with baby gates. So can you give us an update, please, on that process and what you envision happening according to the operating plan on gates in this next fiscal year, please? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely, Commissioner. Thanks for the question. And you're right, gates has certainly been something that for a number of years staff has been very persistent in working with ASTM, and not just as under the Section 104 rubric, but to your point on because of the number of injuries associated with gates. And staff's been very consistent in our approach over the years with ASTM that currently the way the standard's set up, there's one set of performance requirements for gates that are specifically for the top of the stairs, which has a higher performance requirement for push out than other gates in other locations. And our position has been that we feel there should be a higher performance requirement across all gates, regardless of a location, because if you can defeat a gate, you're probably going to get to somewhere you shouldn't be, not just the top of the stairs. I'm really pleased to report that based on the work with ASTM over the last 6 months or so, we have made a real measurable progress with them. You're right, it's been a number of years of writing the same thing, to ASTM, working with them. But just out now for ballot, ASTM has put out a ballot that proposes a performance requirement of that higher push-out requirement for all gates. One of the key things staff has been able to do working with ASTM is set up that there are things called wall cups that may be required in order to pass this higher standard, and then work out with ASTM how you make sure the wall cups are provided with the product, et cetera, and then used with the product. But the key thing is that over the last couple months, staff's been able to make great progress with ASTM and all the other members of ASTM. That's out for ballot now. From a timeline, we expect probably a couple months. Most things from experience don't pass the first time, so a couple months yet, but we have seen some progress, and that progress reflects the change in the mandatory standards table from the final rule in 19 to an NPR, because we deferred the NPR in 18 into 19 as we were doing this work with ASTM.
And in the hopefully unlikely event that the ballot is not successful, does staff, and actually either way, since we still have to do a mandatory rule, does staff plan, or would staff plan as part of the 19 operating plan to pivot to drafting and submitting to the Commission for consideration a notice of proposed rulemaking?
Depending on how the ASTM process works out, that is something we would look at in developing the NPR, very consistent with how we've done the other 104s. Where is the voluntary standard, and is there any other requirements that are necessary to improve safety?
Great. Thank you very much. No further questions this round.
Thank you. Commissioner Biacco.
Thank you. And again, thank you to all of you. I know that in the last few months since I've been here, you've had many meetings in my office to bring me up to speed, and I know it's taken an enormous amount of your time. And I'd like to also thank you for constantly fielding my stream of pointed questions. So thanks again for that. I want to return to a question that Commissioner Adler asked, and that is on recall effectiveness. I am familiar with the RFI that went out and certainly have read it. I think we all agree that direct notice is the best way to reach consumers. And as you know, we have been working on an app for the Consumer Product Safety Commission so that the way consumers get their information, particularly now, many of us get it on our phones, this will be an opportunity for them to have another source of information or notice directly to them. What I'm more interested in, though, is under the term effectiveness, what are we doing to measure consumer behavior and how we get consumers to actually respond to the recall once they get the notice? Either.
I'll give a start to this, Commissioner. This is where I think the engagement portion of the KPMs come into play. What we're trying to see is what kind of reaction or calls to action, if you will, to use the term of art in the media world, are resulting in the kinds of steps to address the recalls that are at hand. Some, obviously, Class A are more import than and have a higher risk to consumers. So we'll want to look at how we were addressing that in terms of a multi-platform strategy. Just to hum a few bars, if I may, to give you a sense of where we're going on thinking on that. The app, as you may know, this commission and the technology team has put together an application programming interface, a feed, if you will, a syndicated feed of the recalls. So there's a lot of talk about the app. Communications would be keen to want to discuss if there was an app launched, how the data on who's using that app would be shared.
Well, there is going to be an app launch, for sure.
Okay, because if it's done through the App Store or the other platforms, Apple doesn't share that data with its developers. So
my question is a little bit more pointed.
Sure.
What are we doing to measure how consumers respond to the recall and getting consumers to actually what our message is, not necessarily how we reach them, because I think that we're doing a good job reaching them. How do we get them to actually respond? What are we doing to determine how that works?
Well, I think the results of how many people have returned products, and compliance might want to weigh in on that a little bit, is probably a measure that is critical here. This is, again, where engagement, because we can say that we had 4 billion impressions in the whole year, but that means that tells us how many TV stations or how many networks or how many TV screens. But in a world where people are looking at their media on demand or looking at their news later in the day, how are we counting that, and what kind of actions are taking? So that's a little bit of the how. We're trying to get at the the actual counting that goes with that, and engagement, I think, is also an emerging field in analytics. So we're just at the early stages, but I hope that gives you some kind of flavor regarding how we're counting the results other than the percentages of actual product that have been returned.
Mr. Kay, maybe I'm still trying to get to, maybe you can help me with this one, what we're doing maybe in compliance to measure consumer behavior once they receive the notice.
Right. So as the Commission's aware, through the MPRs, we measure what the response rates are. And I understand that your question is getting at sort of, well, why did one thing tick a consumer versus another thing? How do we sort of get behind that consumer motivation? To the extent that we have, the Commission directs us to take action further in those areas, including whether we want to reach out and interview consumers about those issues. That's certainly something that we will, would take into account in planning our future use of resources.
Okay, thank you very much. I think if I ask one more question, my time will be up, so I'll pass.
Then we have a gong here. Thank you. So I want to follow up because I do think it's important. And I'll ask Mr. Ray or Dr. Borlace, because let's take the Gates issue. So Gates, and I want to commend staff. They were very creative in their thinking, and that wall cup gets to the 30 pounds that was their position, and felt that there was value to that, to have that same level of restraint both at the top and the bottom of the stairs. So they were creative in coming up with this as a solution to that. But when we are engaged in voluntary standards, there's, in addition to hopefully getting to a successful voluntary standards, what's the other value in a voluntary standard if there's an NPR out there? I mean, my question is, and I'll ask it, you can say yes or no, doesn't any work we do on a voluntary standard inform a mandatory standard? So it isn't an either-or situation. As we are trying to get to a voluntary standard, if we can't, then we've got this work that's already been done to inform us on the mandatory standard.
Let me give a shot at it. I think I view them as tools in our toolkit, and we use different tools at different times to try to get to a result. But if we think about mandatory rulemaking, we always have to, and part of the statute is to take a look at voluntary standards. Are they effective and are they widely complied with as part of a typical fine? The Gate's a little different. We've got a different statutory framework there, but there's a spectrum in that toolkit. So, as we're working Gates, I'll use that example. We're required to work with the voluntary standards, and there is a point where how much is good enough, I think, to Commissioner Kay's question. And I think where we are is trying to find that balance, and there's always questions of did you hit the right balance on working with the voluntary standards. But I think I would double back on Gates as an important point. None of us are Gates manufacturers. We have never built a gate. We have never designed one. We understand engineering and physics and how that works, but we don't understand all the parts that work. But it was clear on this specific issue, we were stuck on where is the right force. I think we had a point that it should be the same to provide the same level of protection, but we could not figure out what was the holdup. And I think staff working through that collaborative process with ASTM has a path forward. It's not done yet, to be clear on that. And, I don't want to count the chickens before they're hatched, but I think we're hopeful that we can get there. But I do think working through that process through the ASTM is helping us kind of get to that place.
Thank you very much. I want to now shift over to data because in addition to my priorities of collaboration, education, data is a big one for me because we are and should be a data-driven agency. And so to Mr. Hoffman's point earlier, our IT budget has been flat, and that makes it very difficult to do anything more than what we already do. When I see a flat budget, it's more the status quo and kind of balancing it that way. I would really like to know whether or not this operating plan improves our ability to collect data and ultimately be able to analyze data. Because as Mr. Ray mentioned, we can have all the data in the world if we don't have the capability of analyzing it. So from a systems point of view, Mr. Rolfs, I would ask you to respond, and then in my next round of questioning, I'll ask Mr. Hanway to come on up, talk to it from an EPI point of view.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. Yes, the operating plan does allow us to improve our ability to analyze data. So several years ago, we did invest in modernizing our analytics, our core analytics platform, and we have been rolling that out and employing additional new capabilities with that ever since, and building capabilities also among the analysts themselves in the use of that tool. We intend to continue to do that within our operating budget through fiscal year 19 as well. We're also through 2018. We have been working collaboratively in a fairly formal way with data analysts from across major program offices in the agency, and also including the IT staff, to look at ways to improve our overall data management and information management maturity capabilities. And some of those things are more foundational kinds of data management practices that we think will ultimately allow us to identify opportunities either for adoption of data standards, consistency in measuring data quality, and then also methods for improving sharing data across various program areas, but doing that in a way that also retains the context of that data so that it's properly interpreted.
My time has expired, Commissioner Adler.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. I want to ask a question about nanotechnology, and I want to zoom to 50,000 feet. When I came to the Commission going on 9 years, soon to be 10 years, nanotechnology was a very hot topic, and we were worried considerably about it, in large part because we didn't understand it, or at least the safety implications of it. And I always had nightmares about waking up one day and having a nano scare, which would extend across a multitude of products, because people don't realize how many nano materials are in the products they have. So now I'm looking at it from today, and to my great relief, as I reflect on what we've done in nanotechnology, I can't think of an instance at this agency where we've had a product safety concern. And then I look at this array of projects we have going on with nanotechnology, and at least for this tiny agency, we are spending a lot of dollars, in the millions of dollars over the years. And I guess my first question would be, given that EPA is spending billions of dollars and other agencies are, how worthwhile is it to continue the activities that we have in mind for nano, as opposed to taking these incredibly scarce dollars and maybe dedicating them to other projects? So that's a cosmic question.
Commissioner, thanks for the question. I think you certainly highlight the key tension between the scarce resources and where do we put it. From our perspective in looking at nanotechnology, as we look at the risk, the one unique risk we're trying to address with the nanotechnology is specifically the exposure from consumer products. Over the years, I think we've done an excellent job of trying to focus on what is our swim lane, trying to build, we execute all the funds through interagency agreements, working with Department of Defense, EPA, and the other agencies that have these very large investments in nanotechnology, trying to focus on our unique question, which is related to the exposure from consumer products. So as we proposed the work in 19, we proposed it in the context of, for the chronic hazard work, for example, we feel this is an investment, but we certainly recognize that from the Commission perspective, there is that larger tension of, do we invest money in nanotechnology versus other, important projects? I think as we go through this, the discussion is these are all important projects, and which are the most important projects, which is always the most difficult decision in front of you.
Yeah, and that's a great answer. And the thing that I still stay awake at night thinking about is the scarce resources. They're all worthy projects. And I guess based on our experience so far and the fact that at least I'm not aware that we've seen any major issues with consumer products in nano, do you have any forecast other than chronic that we're likely to see serious issues of safety with respect to nanomaterials?
I think while we haven't realized any of the scares or concerns, certainly they are still out there, and we have definitely focused our efforts on nanotechnology in the past and even through 19 on trying to address what we think are kind of the most important nano issues. We've focused on children's products. There's a lot of nanomaterials they coat infant, toddler products with because of their antimicrobial, antiviral capabilities, since they put everything in their mouths. If anything we can do to keep bacteria and viruses off the surface, they try and add it. And understanding how does that get transmitted from the actual, toy, rattle, whatever it is there a transmission into the infant? How does that work? Focusing on things related to emissions from different products. Again, back to the exposure.
Yeah, thank you. And just one last question about nano. In the early years, one of the issues before us was nobody was keeping an inventory of consumer products that had nanomaterials, and I think we did some work in that direction. But my understanding is there's now somebody that is actually tracking nanomaterials in consumer products, and it's not us. Am I correct in that?
Yes, we've know there's outside sources that are tracking it, and it's becoming more difficult every year to track it because it's still that exponential growth in nanomaterials as the Federal National Nanotechnology Initiative has had success in better able to cheaply produce nanomaterials. The cost-effective application of them has really increased exponentially, which means their use in consumer products has increased exponentially. And so a lot of our research, focusing on that is just trying to keep up.
Thank you very much, and I do have some data questions that I will follow up to the chairman for.
Thank you. Commissioner Kay, just before you begin, I just want to let Ms. Mills know our timers are back working, so you can. Thank you. Commissioner Kay.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I want to follow up briefly with Commissioner Biacco and just say how pleased I am that you raised the issue of trying to gauge how effective our communications programs are and whether or not they're actually motivating consumers. It's something that we've been working with the Office of Communications with now for a bit of time, and Ms. Joyce has been great, and your deputy, Ms. Davis, about continuing to keep us updated on the specific study we have going on the tip-over campaign. But I'm hopeful that our offices can work together because these are precious dollars, and it's great to yell into the wind, but it would be nice to know that it's actually making a difference. So I hope that there's some common ground that we can find on that and make a difference.
Great.
Thank you for that. Dr. Borlase, to another very dangerous product that is unfortunately harming children on an ongoing basis, that's unnecessarily unstable furniture. And we know the stats with those as well, the deaths and injuries that continue to occur from tip-overs. So I'm curious to know why the staff is recommending changing in the proposed operating plan the work from a moving ahead with the rulemaking to data analysis and technical review.
So thank you for that, and we have been investing and continue to invest a lot of resources, time and money on addressing the tip-over hazard. Since the budget request as we were putting together the operating plan, we are in the post-ANPR stage based on the comments, and then also work with industry associations like AHFA, the ASTM voluntary standard. We're just at a point where in terms of the work in 2019, it's going to be data analysis work in developing the NPR. We are still continuing to work with ASTM on a number of improvements to the voluntary standard. They have had ballots out already on, for example, improvements to the test methodology, which are a direct result of a letter that we sent ASTM earlier this year. We've had outreach from the American Home Furnishings Association on better collaboration with them coming up on addressing a lot of the other factors related to furniture tip over. So the change in the 19 operating plan just reflects the reality of where we are post-ANPR and the work that we see coming up in 19, working with ASTM and the other stakeholders in trying to address the furniture tip-over hazard.
Thank you. And can you give us a sense, stepping back, what's staff's goal in terms of solving this problem? What's success with this issue, and what's the timeline for achieving that success? And then the third part of that is, what part of that should we expect to see accomplished, and in what form in 2019?
So in terms of success overall, I think that what we're looking for is what we feel would be an effective standard that reduces the risk of injury and death from these furniture that tip over. And specifically, we're focusing on the clothing storage units. In terms of, and the second part of the question was, sorry.
What do you expect to accomplish in 19,
Okay.
and how will we see that?
Sure. For accomplishment in 19, a couple specific things. We are grateful that we did get the funding from the commission approved mid-year on 18 with respect to the furniture tip over. So we are purchasing samples. So one of the things that is a specific activity in 19 is that we'll finish procuring the furniture samples to do a broad range of the stability testing as we had laid out in the 18. That will really give us some information on what is the actual stability characteristics of a large number of dressers currently on the market. Where is that compared to the current voluntary standard? That is something that we have heard consistently from industry and others as a question that we know that we need to answer. Additionally, I think you're going to see a lot of additional direct engagement with the furniture industry, ASTM, and others, going to annual meetings. And really, we've been working on this problem for a number of years, and we're kind of getting into a stuck point. And there's we're looking at different ways in 19 to try and get unstuck on this, kind of not to keep bringing up the Gates example, but how do we get unstuck on this the way we finally got unstuck on that?
Got it. And if I can just ask a quick follow-up on the ASTM portion of it. Since November of 2016, staff has been strongly advocating for certain changes to the voluntary standard, specifically moving from 50 pounds to 60 pounds to reflect the anthropometric of children up to age 5. Does staff still stand behind that 60-pound recommendation?
That is still our latest recommendation. That is certainly probably the key sticking point that for years we've just been going back and forth on, and I think that's a key area of emphasis and attention in 19 as we try and just resolve this with the industry.
Great, thank you.
Commissioner Biacco.
Thank you. I just want to close the loop on the recall effectiveness that I'm so interested in. And Mr. Rolfs, thank you for working with me in developing a CPSC app. You and your team did a great job responding to my challenges to have it done, and it looks good, and I'm looking forward to sharing it with the rest of the commission very soon. But as you know, our first step in putting together the app was to use the app as a means of communicating, a different delivery system than in addition to our website of the recalls that are actually out there. If we wanted to take that app to the next level, to use it to measure who's responding or to field questions, how much of that will depend on the number of people we can dedicate to it as opposed to the technical infrastructure we would need to do something like that? Or are they not mutually exclusive?
I'm sorry, can you clarify a little bit about what you mean by number of people? Just
So in other words, if we needed someone to actually, do we need somebody and several people, if you will, to monitor the input? In other words, if we have the app right now, it's going outwards, right? Letting people know these products have been recalled. If we want to take the app to the next level and add an option for a consumer to say, I have this product and I participated, or I didn't participate, or I want more information. In order for us to measure that, is it a matter of technology, or is it a matter of manual monitoring of what comes in?
I suspect that it would be and we'd have to get into a little bit more in terms of the technical requirements, but I think this is likely something that could be automated. So There are some challenges. The app that we've developed is currently in a beta stage, and it leverages existing work and logic that we have, also leveraging the data that we have currently available through our public API. It would be possible to measure the downloads of the app, the number of people who actually install it, at least from directly from our site. We may be able to get metrics in terms of not necessarily who has it, but perhaps the numbers of downloads from other stores, Google, the Google Play Store or the Apple Store, if we're able to publish it to those locations. The app, as it's currently developed, is fairly basic, really primarily allowing people to search for recalls information. This additional tracking piece would be additional work, and presumably, I mean, it would end up being a policy question, but presumably would end up being a voluntary response from the people who use
Correct.
it. But I would imagine that we would be looking for a technical solution to build into the app itself rather than a manual monitoring process.
Okay. Thank you. I'm just thinking long term. Like once we get it up and running, what can we do next? So thank you. Mr. Kay, I'd like to follow up on Chairman Burkle's comments about collaboration, because I also think that that's an important perspective and point. In my briefings as a new commissioner, I have met a few people here, Denise Beatty and Freddie Clare, who do our state and local programs. They do an amazing amount of work with a small group, the two of them, small amount of money. Shelby Mathis, our small business ombudsman, if I understand correctly, there's only 3 people in that group. She does an amazing amount of outreach. How can we capitalize on those types of small groups that we can reach a lot of people using a small amount of people in compliance? Any thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, thank you for recognizing the great work that Denise and Freddie and also Shelby do to get the Commission's messages out there. It really is, as you say, impressive what they do with limited resources. You know, one of the things that makes them so effective, and speaking of all of them, is the extent to which they develop relationships in the communities where they're trying to reach people. You know, when we have events like the hurricanes that we've had recently, you know, Denise knows, you know, exactly where to go to try and help get our messages out. And I think continuing to encourage our staff to develop those relationships and to leverage those relationships as makes it most effective given the issues that we're trying to address is a big part of that. You know, when you don't have the resources to commit many more FTE, then trying to build relationships with others in other agencies and with other communities of interest is the way to try and maximize our impact.
Thank you. And let me follow up on that, and also an issue that Commissioner Adler raised, and that is with regard to nanotechnology. Do we have a dedicated nanotechnology team, if you will, who can reach out to the other agencies, have those relationships, and get the information so we're not reinventing the wheel?
We have dedicated staff in that focus area. I think probably the way to, in my mind, as I distinguish this, we capitalize a small amount of money compared to the whole federal budget on nano to try to get a consumer focus on the research, where if you look at all the other dollars, there's very little focus on consumer products. So that is really how the program works. And so to date, we have not seen opportunities where other agencies are taking that up, because there is very little focus on consumer products with that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Biacco. I want to go back to data, but before I do, because Commissioner Biacco raised an excellent point, and that is I want to publicly thank the Commission and the agency has been actively involved and continues to be actively involved in hurricane safety, and it was really a team of people who put forth an initiative, and Denise Beatty was one of those people. OCM and Erin and her team OLA to get information to the Hill and to governors of affected states. My office was involved, and we even got RELA and some of the retailers to post our brochure on their websites. And so I just want to say that kind of collaboration is pretty effective, and that's the only way we can get our message out, is working with all of the regulated community, all of the various government agencies to help us push out our message. It's a challenge. There's a lot of noise out there, but on hurricane safety, I'm very proud of what the agency has done and continues to do, because we are right deep in the middle of hurricane season. I want to get back to my data issue. Mr. Hanway. What I'd like to talk to you about and hear your thoughts about this morning, and thank you for being here, with data. So I think we can all kind of acknowledge the fact that since CPSIA and since the agency has begun, so many things have changed, including technology. We now have e-commerce. Many consumers really do most of their work online. And to me, e-commerce presents some challenges, but it also presents some opportunities. And I'd like to speak to you, to have you speak about that today, and whether or not there's anything in this ops plan that can help us advance that ball, if there is something to be done there.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Some of our activities are going to be focused on expanding our understanding of what's going on in the hospitals. We're expanding NICE. You've seen that. We'll have delivery from some of our contractors regarding our ability to make small area estimates, which allow us to examine what's going on more regionally. But I think part of it is really our collaborative work, which is where staff can interact directly with some of the retailers to create a better relationship for the delivery of what they provide. And some of that is in conjunction with compliance to make sure that there's a good understanding of what reports are going to be most useful for our agency, and allow us to do things that are useful to promote safety. And not everything that we receive today fits that description. So by creating greater feedback, I think, to those providers of that information, we can get to a place where our data is more useful and a little more manageable.
Thank you very much. Can you just talk to us a little bit about SAS that is in the ops plan, and what your plan is for that?
Yeah, and my thanks to Jim Rolfs for some of the resources he's made available with training and consulting from SAS. We have the additional modules that were purchased with mid-year funds in the past, provided by the Commission, and they are make us better able to handle a lot of unstructured data. That's a lot of the narrative descriptions that really get to the heart of the hazard patterns of what's going on. The process for dealing with that data is very manual, because you don't want to leave out anything that is relevant, so you don't want to do anything that pushes that aside. At the same time, you don't want to pull in things that are not relevant. And what we'd like to do is automate as much of that as we can, so we don't have to spend as much time individually, whether it's our subject matter experts or our statisticians, just reading narratives to classify data.
Thank you. I think I will not ask another question because my time will expire. Commissioner Adler?
Thank you very much. And I did want to pick up on a point that Commissioner Biacco was making, because it's one of those things that makes me so proud to be at this agency, how you have a small group of people who do extraordinary work, well beyond what any reasonable expectation would be, because they're so dedicated. And I will just point out in passing that with a very small staff, the SBO office does tremendous things, but an even smaller staff is our voluntary standards coordinator. So I just reiterate, I'm going to be raising that as an issue when we have our deliberative session. The other point that I want to make is I think that our data collection efforts, oh dear, Steve went away, please come back. I think that the data collection activities that this agency does are unparalleled. We are so small, and yet people still come to us to use our data and to buy our data because we are such an effective data collection office. So I did want to come back to one of the points you made, and that is the regional estimates of consumer product related injuries. We're going to be expanding that, and I first want to know, will that give us more precision? It's going to cost more. What's the nature of this work?
Yeah, this is us being able to receive, which we'll get here in the next few weeks from our contractor. These was a purchase with mid-year funds from fiscal year 17 to allow small area estimation. I think for a long time there have been questions that have come, whether that's through congressional inquiry, some of our state designees, or just when we look at the product in its most relevant context. For example, a snowmobile is a relevant product to be concerned about in certain parts of the country, whereas in, say, Florida, it's not that important. And so you want to consider the risk as it relates perhaps to a particular area, even as we look into the future, certain things like rideshare programs, where what is going on in particular municipalities may be important to consider independently of just some of the national estimation that we do. Small area estimation is a practice that's been around, well established in statistics for a while, to make use of a large instrument like NICE with auxiliary data to be able to make estimates for smaller geographies. So this is our opportunity to learn to do that. What we've asked the contractor to provide is, in addition to the auxiliary data that was purchased as part of that agreement, was a method to allow us to do it ongoing and into the future. So we've asked them to sort of teach us how to fish so that we can make those kinds of estimates into the future.
Yeah, so I know it's always been useful to be able to go to the state of Wisconsin or Minnesota and say, here are the snowboard injuries for your state, or here are the ATV injuries for your state. Are we going to be able to develop that kind of precision, or will it be for the upper Midwest, we estimate X number of injuries? And can't we do that already, I guess was the question I had.
We really couldn't with NICE, and to your point about what geographies we can get to, we can absolutely get to the state level. That is just one of the specifications for what's to be delivered.
That is terrific news. I'm really delighted to hear that. So I'd like to switch to another question, and this has to do with the Internet Surveillance Project, and I guess this is a compliance question. The focus on this, if I understand correctly, is tracking the resale of recalled products. Am I correct? Is it just limited to that, or is it broader than that, looking for products that might be defective that are sold on the Internet?
Yeah, I think it's broader. There's a number of functions that our Internet Surveillance Group engages in support of acquiring samples, of evaluating potentially defective products, of looking for products that are being sold that are recalled. So it's a diverse portfolio that in an age of e-commerce is an important part of what compliance does.
So then my related question, and this just undoubtedly shows my confusion, we have this risk assessment methodology discussion on page 37, and it says that this project will conduct an assessment to document the current state of e-commerce as it relates to CPSC's jurisdiction and how best to identify and interdict high-risk shipments. What's the difference between that and the Internet Surveillance Project? Could somebody enlighten me?
Commissioner, I'm going to ask Jim Jaholski.
Yeah, I saw him. I could see him groaning as I was asking the question.
Good morning. So I think we've all seen the explosion of e-commerce over the years. What the assessment that you referred to, this is kind of our initial work in this area from an import surveillance perspective. This is going to be a contract, and what we're hoping to get out of this is basically, as an initial work, an assessment of kind of how CPSC can fit into this space of e-commerce, and looking at e-commerce from our jurisdiction, look at the volumes of e-commerce coming in, the locations where those shipments are coming in, kind of what our capabilities are and where we need to go with this. I think this is going to be a layered approach to looking at e-commerce. When our office was established 10 years ago, our staffing model was really looking at the largest ports of entry where containerized products are coming in. Obviously, over the last 10 years, commerce has changed dramatically, and we need to figure out, as an agency, I think, and there's been a lot of discussion about e-commerce, it's come up several times, how the agency fits into this space, and this is our first step in it from an import surveillance perspective.
Thank you. I'll probably return to this. My time is up. Thank you.
Commissioner Kay?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Borlace, if you could return, please. You're welcome, Mr. Jaholski.
Don't get too comfortable.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Borlace. I'd like to continue talking about and getting your views on persistent hazards that there remains an urgency to address, and the next one is portable generators. We've obviously been spending a lot of time on this in the last few years about moving forward with rulemaking, and we had seen and have seen great progress both in terms of what staff has been able to develop and also in terms of 2 different industry voluntary standards. And so can you give us a clearer sense, please, of what staff will be working on in 2019 and what the deliverable will be on portable generators?
So, no, thank you for that. And certainly portable generators has been one where a lot of progress in the last 2 years in trying to address the standard, both with the NPR that the Commission approved and then the 2 voluntary standards that you mentioned in the last year. Staff's focus on FY19 and generators is almost wholly on the work with NIST through an interagency agreement on evaluating both the UL and the PGMA standard as they've come out. We started the work in FY18. Thanks to the Commission at the mid-year, we do have additional funds in that that we've already executed with NIST. And we are focusing with them to have testing of evaluating the effectiveness of both the UL and the PGMA standard, and have that have at least initial report back from NIST by the summer of of calendar year 19, summer of calendar year 19, to have that. The work with NIST, because of the shutoff technologies, we are looking at different approaches than specifically how we did it in the NPR, and so that level of complexity plus the fact that we have 2 standards means it's going to be a lot of work by staff between now and the summer.
And thank you. And beyond the NIST report, which obviously will be public, do you anticipate a specific staff deliverable to the Commission in FY19 on this?
I'm going to cheat and look at the mandatory standards table. The briefing package that we have listed there for 19 is specifically based on the results of NIST and what we've seen, in terms of looking at the effectiveness of those 2. That's what we anticipate will be specifically in the briefing package. Other deliverables that you'll see will include public meetings with industry and other stakeholders. We're looking at having one in early October already, specifically to make sure everybody understands our approach as we're going forward with this work with NIST.
Great, thank you. And if I can turn to another continuing urgent hazard with children, and that's window coverings, another area that we've spent a lot of time on over the years. Could you let me know, please, why the window coverings rulemaking project was removed from the proposed operating plan?
The work as we've laid out in 19 on window coverings is really focused on the voluntary standard work, working with the Window Covering Manufacturers Association, which is the SDO, on that. Since that's where we are in terms of what we're proposing to the Commission, that's just reflected in the mandatory standards table. So it really just reflects where we are and what staff's proposing in 19.
And similar to portable generators, what do you anticipate to be the staff deliverable for the Commission in 2019?
I think as a specific deliverable, there's not necessarily like a report that's proposed, although should the Commission, whatever the Commission directs, we'll make sure we execute. We do see the effort being working with WCMA and the other SDO members on not just following up because the revised standard becomes effective in December, but following up with them as they've committed to addressing the custom window coverings in what amounts to FY19.
Great, thank you. And then in the remainder of my time, just again on voluntary standards, I noticed that there were 2 voluntary standards amongst those that staff proposed removing sort of active work on. 2 of them had to do with firearms, one with gun locks and one with gun safes. And since staff had submitted a report within the last year to the voluntary standards body assessing the test methods and providing recommendations, I was curious to know why staff is proposing removing those designations as active voluntary standards work.
Thank you. On shifting gears to that one, we had sent in the report in earlier fiscal year 18, and that reflected, yes, that we were not planning on actively working on it. That being said, should ASTM pick up momentum and start really working on this one, or as they do, if we need to engage with them, we certainly will. Just because we have proposed taking it off doesn't mean that it also, we're proposing prohibiting staff from working on that voluntary standard activity if it happens in 19.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Kay. Commissioner Bialko.
Mr. Joholski, can I bring you back up, please?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much. One thing that I've been very focused on is just how many counterfeit or non-compliant products are coming into the United States and at what breakneck speed. And I think that what your team is doing at the ports is amazing, especially with the limited number of people that you have. If you could have more people in a perfect world, how many more legitimately would you want to ask for?
That's a difficult question to answer. I think I would address it this way. As I mentioned just a couple minutes ago, our staffing model has really focused on staffing folks at the largest ports of entry. We have great relationship with Customs and Border Protection. We're very happy to have you come up to the Port of Newark in a couple of weeks for a tour, and I think you'll see that firsthand. I think where staffing is going to come into play is more as we look at e-commerce in more detail. Right now we have a very minor footprint in those locations where e-commerce shipments come in. When you start thinking about the large express courier hubs, international mail facilities, that is, I think, an area in the future that we're going to have to look at as far as resource dedication. Because obviously identifying high-risk e-commerce shipments is the first step. You got to have boots on the ground to examine them. That number of how many people, I think, is a little in flux now because we need to get more data in as far as where those shipments are going to be arriving and then what resources we would want to dedicate to it.
Okay, when you're ready, please let us know, because I'm very focused on this. I think it's very important, especially at this time. And on the technology side, so I read this e-filing certificate of compliance study assessment. I thought it was pretty good. Granted, I understand it's a pilot program, but if I understand correctly, and Commissioner Adler, I think this might follow up on some of the questions you were asking, we have in the RAM system, we work closely with Border Control, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and in the RAM system, we have basically flags, little factors that flag maybe non-compliant pallets or what have you so that we can focus on those. And I understand from reading the assessment that we did some studies on additional factors, and the recommendation in here was that we follow up because we didn't have enough statistics to actually make a decision, but there was definitely some things that were showing up. What is the plan? I know it's addressed in the OP plan generally, but can you tell me what the plan is for the next steps on that? Because I think this is important.
Yeah, so this is our e-filing project that we've been working on for a few years now to try to identify additional data that might be available that could increase our ability to identify high-risk shipments. So we started back in 2016 and we did an e-filer alpha pilot. And what that was is it involved 8 importer volunteers where we essentially set up a system where they could file additional data with us. We could receive it and process it. Unfortunately, as part of that pilot, we weren't able to assess how useful the data was. So the report that you were referencing is our analysis of the data itself. The task that we're working on right now is to take the lessons that we've learned from the alpha pilot, what we've learned from the certificate study, and we're going to come up with some options that we'd like to share with the Commission as far as what could be potential next steps in the e-filing process. And then we'll wait some direction from the Commission as far as where we go from here.
Not to put you on the spot, but when can we expect that? Just interested.
So that task is scheduled we're in the midst of it right now, scheduled to end in early January. So we should have a report to the Commission right around that time.
Terrific. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to the port tour as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to, Jim, as long as you're there, I was almost going to call you Mr. K. I do want to talk a little bit about RAM, and it's been raised already. And over the years, we have expanded our control of RAM and how we are able now to do much more ourselves. I'd like you to just comment on whether or not you think what we've invested in this will help our ability to determine what's coming in and to assess risk as products are coming into this country.
I definitely do. We've, the movement from sort of RAM 1.0 to RAM 2.0, where we got off the proprietary software, was a huge step forward for us. I think the work that we've done in this year and next year to try to incrementally advance the system is going to be very beneficial. This is one of our layered approaches to targeting. We use the RAM system. Our staff uses that at the ports. We do targeting on a national level through the Commercial Targeting and Analysis Center with CBP, and then we work locally with CBP staff on local operations. All of these are very important and help us get to those high-risk shipments. So I think the advances to RAM, yes, are very beneficial.
Good. Thank you very much. And I do just want to commend Jim publicly on the work he does with the BIC and the intergovernmental group that works on all of these issues. He really is a very respected member of that group, and I think that relationship with CBP and so many other government agencies is key to our success as we look at products coming into this country. So thank you for that work.
Thank you.
It was mentioned earlier, and I want to get back to it, because essentially we're seeing a new paradigm in commerce and how consumers get products and how they're buying products. But beyond that, so besides the new global marketplace, we're seeing IoT, which we had a hearing on this past year, 3D printing, another issue. I'd like to, and I'll ask Mr. Ray and then Dr. Borlace, and I should add, we've done a lot of work with lithium-ion batteries, and we'll continue to do that work as well. I'd like to get your comments on what's in the ops plan and whether or not that work will continue, and how important is it for us to have our eye on these emerging technologies.
I'm going to steal George's thunder. He can probably speak a lot more to this than I will, but I think we've identified and we have projects in there supporting all of those initiatives you just described. IoT, and I'll let George get into all the details, but we still remain focused on looking at that as the emerging technology and what, if any, hazards that it could bring up, the unintended consequence, right? 3D printing, I think that's still an area. I think we've talked a little bit about nano, and there's some concerns and studies we're looking at from that perspective, but also just how these are used and can be used to produce consumer products, by pushing print. And I think we've had some recent briefings on the lithium-ion work. I think we're going to continue to do the support there, both on standards and our intergovernmental work to encourage that. But I think there's plenty of projects in the op plan that continue to support those priorities.
Thank you. Dr. Borlace?
I'll just kind of maybe use IoT to highlight kind of the breadth of work, and then also how we have to look at it, as you described in the new paradigm. In the Internet of Things, I think you see in 19 specific work from staff to kind of move from listening learning mode, especially from what we learned from the hearing in the spring. For example, on voluntary standards, proposing adding Internet of Things as a voluntary standard. I think as you see thematically, whether it's batteries, wearables, Internet of Things, we really have to address these as the Internet of Things is not a product. It's the capability of a number of consumer products, and it's growing exponentially. You know, we've seen fidget spinners where they put in a Bluetooth speaker just because you could. It's almost like the engineer in me appreciates the challenge of trying to do that. That was probably why they did it. But there's a real challenge there in that it's not product specific by product as we kind of look at things. So it's working with ASTM, who has just announced that they want to do what they would call like a horizontal standard to try and look across different standards at how you address Internet of Things. And I bring that as just a highlight of, under this new paradigm, how do we have to look at these things not just as specific products but capability of products. When they talk about artificial intelligence, it's not a consumer product in and of itself. It's really a way you program the software that's in a number of consumer products.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Adler.
Mr. Jaholski, just because you're at the table, I wanted to ask sort of an impressionistic question, and that is that we read about the growth of e-commerce, and we worry a lot about international shipments, small shipments directly to consumers. Is there any metric that you're aware of that can tell us what the growth is and what the likely future is, just to give me a perspective?
I do have a couple of stats, actually. So I was at CBP has an annual trade symposium, which I attended about a month or so ago, and the Commissioner of Customs spoke at that event. And he mentioned in 2016, there were 300 million small packages that arrived in the U.S. In 2017, that number was 600 million. So 300 million to 600 million. And then the chairman and I actually attended a meeting where the CEO of FedEx Trade Solutions spoke, and he mentioned that FedEx is estimating that cross-border e-commerce is expected to grow 15% per year through 2022. So, I think that just gives you, it's a snapshot, but it gives you a little bit of perspective of how fast this is growing. I know I sit in and attend a lot of meetings with other government agencies, and this is a topic that is talked about basically in every meeting.
Thank you. That really does give a good sense of perspective, and I appreciate that. What I also wanted to ask is, and I don't know whether this is a question to Ms. Joyce or to Mr. Kay, and that is recalls using social media. And I guess, again, I have one of these simple threshold questions. What percentage of recalls that we participate in do we use social media? And do we have a sense that it's making a difference, that we're getting more effective responses when we use social media in recalls?
I'll start on this. Sorry. I would estimate about 90% of the recalls have a social media messaging component. It's generally, if it's a recall involving 1,000 units or less, and the level of perceived harm or substantial product risk generally helps to dictate just how far and wide. So because we worry about becoming essentially white noise in the Twitter stream, if you will, too. So, but generally speaking, about 90% of all the recalls that this agency does has a social media component of some sort that we work in compliance with.
And we do now, FY19 will be the first full year where we have sort of an automatic uploading to the data repository of those recalls, and we'll be able to use that to set a percentage in terms of understanding how frequently we're utilizing social media.
Yeah, one of the things I keep hoping is that we're going to get some technology that really substantially boosts the recall effectiveness. And the example I keep giving is you go in to put little baby Precious in the crib, and the crib says, "Don't put Precious in me. I've been recalled, and here's what you need to do." We haven't reached that point yet, but I keep waiting for technology, and I thought maybe social media was going to give us some sort of order of magnitude improvement, and it may be. We just don't know that yet. Is that fair?
Well, that's, that example is, you sort of reflect back on what we talked earlier about direct notice. I mean, that's the very best direct notice. The product itself announces to you that it's been recalled, and I think that amongst some of the other ideas that we're considering with respect to what the right role is for us to play in promoting direct notice feeds into that ideal.
I think also, if I may quickly, Commissioner, this also reflects the rise of the Internet of Things, too, because
Absolutely.
that product can also be sending back data for registration so that direct notice can happen. And, of course, many other issues that are involved in that in terms of privacy and inter-jurisdictional. But I think this gets to the heart of some of the issues that this agency is following with IoT.
And you mentioned Twitter, so let me just ask a quick question about it. On page 34, we were talking about Twitter, and this shows a jump in the number of Twitter followers and other CPSC social media signed up to receive our safety messages in English and Spanish. It's going to jump from 50,000 in FY 2018 to 70,000 in 2019. How is that happening? Can you explain that? And also, just for my own curiosity, how many of those will be in English and how many of those will be in Spanish?
Well, that's the goal, and we're going to be relying on our partners and influencers for sure to help us expand our followers and our reach. Right now, the Spanish language version of the agency's Twitter feed has about 2,800 followers. So we're going to be looking at more of a percentage of that, say 2% or so, if you had to try to add 500 users, that kind of thing. So that's how the metric is working out. So that's more of an aggregate number in terms of our entire Twitter presence, 50,000 to 70,000. But the bulk of that will be on the English language CPSC feed. We think we can get there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Kaye.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Jaholski, I'd like to just spend a little bit more time, if we can, please, on really your groundbreaking study on the e-certificate, the small study that had been done, or the e-filing and certificates. If we can just revisit that study for a moment, the conclusion, as I recall, was that in essence there was a very high correlation between those who could not produce a certificate of compliance within 24 hours and ultimately non-compliance of their product itself. Is that accurate?
That is. I just jump in with a little more detail. So what the study really was looking at trying to identify what we would consider to be significant violations. So your lead, phthalates, F963, flammability, and specifically excluded tracking labels and other type of labeling issues. So we're really trying to get at the heart of what we focus on at import. And as you mentioned, we found for those shipments where a certificate could not be provided at all, that a shipment was 5 times more likely to have a significant violation than when a certificate could be provided. And when a certificate could be provided but was provided after 24 hours, it was 3 times more likely to have a violation. So that was the main finding that came out of the study.
And we really appreciate the work that went into it. That certainly seems to take us further down the road of refining the types of information that we think is relevant to identifying higher risk shipments. So if we can just get a little bit more clarity, please, in terms of the proposed operating plan and FY19, what should the Commission expect to see in terms of moving further down that road of understanding that type of information that's key to that identification?
Yes, so what we're working on right now, as I mentioned to Commissioner Biacco, is we're looking back at what happened during the Alpha pilot and what we learned from that, what we've now learned from the certificate study. And our goal is to come up with some options and mainly looking at different levels of what type of data could be useful for us in the next stage of whatever e-filing may look like. We're going to put that options list together and we're going to provide it to the Commission because really, as in the past, as you know, the Commission really has made decisions on what data elements would be provided, and so we would be looking for direction from the Commission. I think it's also an important point to note that moving forward, looking at aligning this to some budget year because of the cost that could be associated with it.
Well, and you anticipated my next question, which is, and thank you for giving more clarity, to the extent that the Commission moves to act on whatever recommendations that you anticipate, do you believe that those will be something that will be funded out of 19, or would that require future year funding?
My personal opinion is it would be future year funding. As part of this task, what we're going to do is try to come up with some rough estimates of costs that would be associated with this from a project management perspective, from a IT perspective. Also, again, making sure that we stay focused on burden to the trade and making sure that's in line, with what type of benefits we're going to get from the data.
Great. Thank you very much. We really look forward to that. And Dr. Borlase, on continuing the discussion about staff deliverables on the Internet of Things, can you specify a little bit more, please? What exactly, I know that you said moving from listening to working with the voluntary standards, but what are the proposed deliverables from staff to the Commission on the Internet of Things for FY19?
It would be, the specific deliverable would be reflected in the V-STAR report, but I'll kind of highlight the three prongs of activities, if you will. I mentioned the voluntary standards activities already. We have also engagement with our other federal partners, for example, with NIST, Patty Adair, especially in the Internet of Things team. They just visited NIST last week at their Center of Excellence. And in improving that relationship, not an area that we usually work in with respect to software and information technology from the emerging side, not the Jim Rolfe's application side. And so we're, getting smarter on that with people like NIST. And then third, engaging with the external stakeholders and the international community. Working with Consumer Technology Association, the other industry associations, and then also looking at international partnerships through the International Programs Office. So the deliverable will be reflected really in the V-STAR report.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Bialko.
Thank you. Commissioner Adler, great question on the small products coming in. That'll keep me up at night because all I can see is these small products that are coming in that we have no idea to control what's in them. And parents or consumers who are trying to save a few bucks and ordering online, these products are coming in, they're not compliant with the appropriate standards and rules, and they're going to lead to a safety problem. Any thoughts on where we go from there?
I think we need to focus kind of on three areas when it comes to e-commerce. The first is data, not to dive too far into the weeds, but we get a feed of data from Customs right now that we use in our RAM for risk assessment. That's called entry data. And those are for larger shipments, generally speaking. Small e-commerce shipments are cleared by Customs off of what's called manifest data. That is data that's provided by a carrier, and it has less specificity. Currently, right now, we don't get a feed or have access to in any significant way this manifest data. So I would say one of the things that we need to focus on as it relates to e-commerce is the right data to be able to risk assess shipments. And some of that data may be available through CBP, quite frankly. Some of that data may be available from platforms, from express carriers. I think, this is an area when you talk about collaboration with the trade, this may be an area that's ripe for that. So I would say data is number one. Number two is something we just talked about just a couple minutes ago, is staffing. Making sure that you have staff at the right locations to be able to examine shipments that you want to look at. And then the third aspect of this is kind of an enforcement aspect. To make sure, because you are dealing with small shipments, and we kind of right now have a one-size-fits-all way of collecting samples, testing samples, processing, test results, and looking at perhaps streamlining that so that it is in line with the size of a shipment that we're encountering at an e-commerce facility.
Okay, let's definitely follow up on that. I have a significant interest in that. One last question. I don't know if this is for Mr. Ray or Dr. Borles, but I read in the ARP plan that there is in the EXHR portion of the OP plan a discussion on burden reduction. Does any of that burden reduction apply to us? Any burden reduction on you all and your teams?
I think if we look under Project 25727, four big projects jump out there. One of them describing how we handled detained shipments. Ultimately, how we take a look at that review, there may be some impacts internally on the workload and how we process that. Without having the full recommendation before us now, I think there is at least some sense there may be some reduction in those areas.
No, I think that's all I have. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much. And I do not have any further questions. I'll go to Commissioner Adler.
I have a few, but not that many. So one quick question. On page 25, I see a project that is to develop a reporting mechanism for triage hazards. Can somebody tell me what that is?
Yeah, that's actually, we're going to be submitting a technical correction as to the exact wording that should read.
That's under control ID at the bottom, and it's
it really, what it
M21.
What it should read, Commissioner Adler, is evaluate the current process of triaging low-level hazards and Section 15 reports to identify any improvements. In a limited resource environment, we want to be putting our resources where the higher risks are, and the triaging concept is the idea of diverting resources from reports and other information that may not present as higher risk. And so as part of our evaluation of how we're using our resources, we are going to take a look, and this is something that's ongoing. We're already taking measures to try and direct our resources towards more high-risk items, and that's going to continue.
Yeah, I heartily approve. I just didn't understand what the listing was. Another very quick question. On page 11, under retailer reporting, this states that we are conducting a business process evaluation of the retailer reporting program, and here's a quote, to identify pathways to maximize utility of data and scope of the program through potential capability enhancements. I have no idea what that means. Could somebody please explain that?
I'll dumb it down for myself. Basically, we're going to look at the program.
Two levels below that for me.
I think Steve kind of hinted at this earlier. We've been collecting data for a number of years. What's the utility of the data we're dealing with? And two, how can we get of the data that we're getting the right data that we really want to get at? And so that's looking at whether it's through methods, whether it's through more prescriptive definitions that we provide, and trying to get the right balance there on that data set.
Yeah, and what you're talking about from my very limited perspective is signal to noise. And so this is one of those programs that in broad concept sounds terrific, but at least it feels to me over the years that it's been of limited utility. And I guess my question is this one where we are absolutely convinced that we want to retain and improve it, or are the returns not yet in on whether this has been a useful program?
I think we are still leaving that option there. I think there are examples where we have used some data that we received through that program to help in voluntary standards, specific some 104 rulemaking activities, where it's been helpful to provide recommendations for standards development. But I think we still need to take a look at that. Is that it? I think beyond that data set, looking at our current incident data that we're getting in through a number of different methods, and is that the right source? Do we need to expand those sources to get at where this hazard data is? So and the other part of that is, I think you see in there's a project about integrated teams, and looking at that, looking at, is there a better way to look at the data coming in to trigger those questions and review.
I'm glad that the ongoing critical scrutiny is occurring, and this one that I'm paying attention to, so I'll probably return to that. I guess my last question, on page 23, we talk about 15J rules, and can somebody tell me whether we've actually identified an additional project under 15J, or is that one where we keep the resources at least contingent and we'll get to it? And I guess the other is, are we actively looking for candidates for 15J rules?
We don't currently have any candidates selected, but we do keep that project sheet there available if there's, so there's not a lot of resources dedicated to that.
Thank you. Those are all the questions I have.
Thank you, Commissioner Adler. Commissioner Kay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Borlase, on an area of also significant concern is chemical exposure, especially to children. And so 2 areas I wanted to understand better. Could you provide, please, a status update on what staff's work will be or is anticipated to be in fiscal year 19 with crumb rubber?
Turn to my notes on the crumb rubber. So we've continued the work that we've had in the previous fiscal year, specifically focused on the playgrounds as CPSC's piece of it. So an update on where we are. We know that EPA is completing their work on some of the toxicity assessments. We do not yet have their report. We're waiting on that for that piece to come in. With respect to the playgrounds, a lot of the focus for us in FY19 is related to the survey that we have received the funding for previously, set up the contract mechanisms for, to look at the surveys related to exposure of the children on the playgrounds. So that's been kind of our consistent focus over the years. We plan on continuing to execute that in 19.
And so is there a specific deliverable that you anticipate?
Not a specific deliverable other than continuing the contract work on the survey with OMB approvals and then continuing on.
Okay, thank you. And then also related to chemical exposure, in years past, staff has worked to support the development of voluntary standards on upholstered furniture with the goal of improving fire safety. And in recent years, there was an increased concern that one of the pathways to do that might inadvertently lead to chemical exposure, both to firefighters as well as to others in the home. The Commission has in part dealt with that by adopting language to bless staff's continued work in that area as long as that does not or would not inadvertently lead to chemical exposure. Will that guidance continue for the staff to the extent, and I know that there had been a recent closing of one of the one of the voluntary standards efforts, but to the extent that that voluntary standards process resumes, is that staff's continued approach to support as needed, but not to inadvertently lead to increased chemical exposure?
Yes, that staff approach hasn't changed.
Great, thank you very much. And on the annual milestones in the operating plan, on page 20, the list of annual milestones omits milestones for several rulemaking activities that are listed on page 9's mandatory standards list. Could you give us some explanation for why it was drafted that way, please?
Sure. Every year what we try and do is have any of the deliverables captured once. My supervisor doesn't like it when I double count success. So we try and only ever put it in one place. And so the rulemakings are captured under the key performance measure 2.2.02 number of candidates for rulemaking. So we try and do then is just as milestones would be briefing packages or some of those non-NPR final rule type packages which get captured in the key performance measure.
I see. And so there are no milestones, though, for consumer registration cards, the notice of proposed rulemaking for crib bumpers, crib mattresses, NPR, and the gates and other enclosures, NPR. Should we read anything into that, or is that really just about improved bookkeeping?
No, it's just that those are specifically captured in the key performance measure, and the key performance measures are the ones we report out to Congress. So we've got it captured in there.
I see. Thank you. And then also in terms of reporting data, both to Congress and to the public, we had talked in the past about seeing if it's possible to take what we now have as an annual all-terrain vehicle report on the deaths and injuries and expanding that out to really be a report that talks about all type of off-road vehicles within our jurisdiction, especially ROVs, so that in the future, ideally, the report would not only talk about ATV injuries and provide those updates, but also would include ROVs. Is it possible, or does staff anticipate doing that, and what are the resource implications of that?
No, thank you for that, because, so based on conversations on that, we have looked at, while staff is proposing the annual report being ATVs, we have looked at what would it be if the commission direction was to expand that to be off-highway vehicle report. And the estimate is that would be on the order of 2 staff months in order to do that. So certainly, should that be something the commission wants to do, is expand it, working through the executive director's office, I'm sure we could then talk about what that would require.
Thank you. My time has expired.
Thank you. Commissioner Biacco, do you have anything else? I don't. I do not. Commissioner Kay? Adler, sorry.
Nothing else, thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I do have a good amount more, but I'm totally comfortable if you want to follow the normal process and just have us submit these questions for the record and have staff respond in writing. That's fine. If we want to wrap up, that works for me too. It's up to you.
I think there's unanimous agreement. Let me see some head nods here at the table. Does that work for everyone?
Then I'll hold the questions and submit them pretty quickly to the Office of the Executive Director. Thank you very much.
I appreciate that. So having heard no further, I'll say, verbal questions, I would like again to thank staff, to Mr. Hoffman, Mr. Baker, Mr. Ray, Dr. Borlace, Mr. Jaholski, Mr. Kay, Mr. Rolfus. I want to say Aaron, but I can't. Ms. Joyce. And to all who participated in putting together the ops plan and gave us this valuable document for us to chart a path forward in the next fiscal year. Before I gavel down, I want to again welcome Commissioner Biacco. Rock, I don't know if you're able to show your face. Are you tied up back there to introduce yourself to the world? Yeah, he did fix the timers. There he is. Thank you very much. I do want to just point out, too, not related to the ops plan, but today, for those of you who would like to know that, it's Caitlin's birthday. So if you stop by, you can wish her happy birthday. And tomorrow, it is Commissioner Adler's birthday. So we're not talking, that's right, just happy birthday. With that, I will conclude this public meeting of the United States Consumer Product Safety Commission meeting and thank all of you for your participation.